Tonight we travel back to where civilization itself first learned to speak, to the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, where the world's first cities shimmered beneath a desert moon. Here, in what we now call Mesopotamia, humanity took its first careful steps toward writing, law, and gods who would shape not just their world, but the imagination of all who followed. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you're listening right now, share your location and your local time in the comments. It's always amazing to see how far our little nighttime circle reaches. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let tonight's journey unfold around you. The night air over ancient Sumer was warm and still. The scent of wet clay drifted from the riverbanks, where water wheels creaked and frogs sang softly. Beneath the sky's heavy curtain of stars, oil lamps flickered in small mud brick homes, and inside, families whispered prayers to unseen powers. The people here believed that every gust of wind, every ripple in the river, every shadow on the wall was moved by a divine hand. And perhaps, to them, that hand was very real. This land, shaped by floods and famine, brilliance and brutality, was where people first began to record their thoughts in writing. On damp clay tablets, a stylus pressed wedge-shaped symbols, carving ideas that had once existed only in breath and memory. One of the first things these scribes wrote down were the names of their gods: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, and Inanna, beings known collectively as the Anunnaki. The word meant those who came down from the heavens. It wasn't a metaphor to the Sumerians, it was history. They believed their gods had descended to shape the world, to lift dust into flesh, to crown the first kings, and to mark the fates of mortals in celestial script. By day, the world of Sumer shimmered with movement. Canals cut through fields of barley and date palms. Shepherds guided their flocks, and merchants from faraway lands, the Indus, Anatolia, even the mountains of Iran, arrived with their goods. The markets of Uruk and Eridu buzzed with voices, the exchange of grain for lapis, copper for wool. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, that same world turned inward toward myth. The stars were no mere ornaments to these people. They were messages. The priests of Sumer would climb to the rooftops and ziggurats, tracing patterns in the night sky, whispering to each other, "Anu moves tonight. Enlil stirs the wind. Inanna crosses the moon's silver path." Historians still argue whether the Sumerians invented astronomy or astrology first, whether their observations were scientific or sacred. But for them, it was all one and the same. To understand the heavens was to understand the will of the gods. It's fascinating to think that much of what we take for granted, writing, calendars, city planning, all began here in a culture built on reverence for the divine. Every brick in their temples was laid with ritual precision, accompanied by murmured hymns. Even the beer they brewed, and yes, they loved their beer, was dedicated to Ninkasi, the goddess of fermentation. There's actually a surviving recipe for Sumerian beer, written in cuneiform, which some modern brewers have tried to recreate. The verdict? Sweet, thick, and surprisingly strong. But not all was as serene as it might sound. The people of Sumer lived in the constant shadow of the unpredictable rivers that both nourished and threatened them. The Tigris and Euphrates could bring rich silt one year and catastrophic flooding the next. To the Sumerians, these weren't random acts of nature, they were moods of the gods. When the river rose too high, it was Enlil's anger. When crops failed, it was Inanna's neglect. That worldview made life feel like a delicate negotiation between the mortal and divine. Each city, from Ur to Lagash, had its own patron deity, its own rituals meant to keep cosmic balance. Priests mediated between people and gods, reading omens from animal livers or the patterns of smoke. It might sound strange now, but in many ways those priests were the first scientists, collecting data, interpreting patterns, and seeking cause and effect, albeit through the lens of the sacred. A curious tidbit: ancient Sumerian cities often had temple accountants. These weren't priests in robes, but rather scribes who tallied offerings, rations, and sacrifices. They're the reason we have some of the earliest written records at all. So in a way, humanity owes its entire concept of accounting, and arguably civilization itself, to the need to please the gods. Some modern accountants like to joke that their profession began as divine bookkeeping. But among the ordinary people, though, daily life was simpler. Farmers sang to the fields, potters shaped clay under the sun, yet even in their songs one can sense the hum of myth, a deep cultural heartbeat that believed life was a gift from beings beyond the stars. And perhaps that belief wasn't just metaphor. Some Sumerian texts speak of the Anunnaki not as invisible spirits, but as tangible beings, tall, radiant figures who came from the heavens in fiery chariots, bringing knowledge of metalwork, medicine, and astronomy. These passages have fascinated modern theorists for decades. Were the Anunnaki truly gods, or something else entirely? Of course, scholars still debate what these descriptions meant. Were they poetic ways of describing celestial phenomena, comets, storms, eclipses, or literal encounters with beings the Sumerians could not otherwise explain? There's no consensus, only fragments, worn by time and fire. But one thing is certain: these stories mattered deeply to the people who told them. As night deepens over the ancient city of Uruk, a lone priest stands at the top of a ziggurat. Below him, oil lamps flicker like fireflies. He lifts his gaze toward the vast darkness above, the same stars you can see tonight, and wonders what they're trying to say. Somewhere in that silence, the first whisper of the Anunnaki lingers, echoing across 5,000 years. They said the Anunnaki came when the earth was young and silent, before plows carved the soil, before kings wore crowns, before even the rivers had chosen their paths. The Sumerians didn't imagine them as ghosts or wisps of light, but as beings of presence and purpose. When they descended, it wasn't with thunder, but with the quiet authority of those who had come to organize a chaotic world. The early myths tell it simply: from heaven to earth they came. That phrase, written in the sharp strokes of cuneiform, appears again and again on ancient tablets. To the Sumerians, the heavens were not a place of vague spirituality. They were a physical realm, just as real as the marshes of Eridu or the gardens of Uruk. The Anunnaki were said to have crossed that boundary with intention, each assigned a role, a city, and a domain. They were not one god, but many, a great council, each with their own purpose. At their head stood Anu, the father of the heavens. His children, Enlil and Enki, would shape the air and waters below, while other divine figures would govern love, war, the underworld, and even the balance of truth. The Anunnaki were not always benevolent, nor were they cruel. They were order itself, the blueprint for a functioning universe. Imagine for a moment the plains of southern Mesopotamia, shimmering in heat. Dust devils swirled between new-built canals. To the west, dunes whisper with wind. And then, as the myth tells, from the sky came brightness, not blinding like the sun, but steady and gold. The Anunnaki descended to a place later called Eridu, the home of the gods. the first city ever made. Historians still argue whether Eridu was a literal city or a symbolic origin, but archaeologists have in fact found its ruins, layer upon layer of settlement, some dating back over 7,000 years. Deep beneath those ruins lies the earliest temple known to humankind, built for a god of water and wisdom. That god was Enki, one of the very first of the Anunnaki to arrive. According to the legend, the gods came not simply to rule, but to establish. They measured the land, named the rivers, and set their courses. They created the calendar by observing the moon's reflection on the waters of the Euphrates. The days began to flow like the rivers themselves, steady, predictable, divine. Yet even gods, it seemed, grew weary. The tablets tell that the Anunnaki found the labor of shaping and maintaining the earth exhausting. The canals clogged, the winds rebelled, the animals ran wild. So they turned to a clever idea, one that would change everything: the creation of humankind. But that story would come soon enough. For now, the Anunnaki still walked alone upon the dust. Among their ranks were Inanna, god of the moon, Utu, the shining sun, and Inanna, radiant and unpredictable, embodying the fierce beauty of the morning star. Theirs was a family not unlike any human one, full of alliances, rivalries, and complicated affections. The Sumerians didn't worship perfection, they worshipped reflection. Their gods had flaws, moods, laughter, and even moments of doubt. One ancient hymn describes the descent of the Anunnaki as a procession of brilliance. They came down from the heavens like the storm, clothed in radiance, their words shaping the destinies of all things. It's worth noting that some fringe researchers have taken that line quite literally. They suggest that the storm might have been an ancient description of flight, the roar of engines, the glow of descending craft. Most historians roll their eyes at that, noting poetic exaggeration was common in Sumerian myth. Yet even among scholars, there's quiet intrigue. How did these early people imagine beings who descended from the sky long before telescopes, airplanes, or science fiction? There's a theory, and it's only a theory, that the Anunnaki represented the natural forces the Sumerians saw as coming down from above: rain, sunlight, moonlight, and time itself. To them, the heavens were always the giver, and so the phrase, "those who came from heaven," might simply have meant those who give life. Still, the stories persist with uncanny detail. The Anunnaki weren't only celestial, they were administrators. They formed councils to divide the duties of creation. Enlil took the air, Enki the waters, and Ninhursag the earth. Others governed fertility, storms, and the underworld. They wrote decrees, which dictated how civilization should work, everything from justice to weaving. Each was like a divine instruction manual, stored in the temples of the gods. In one tale, Enki gives the sacred to humankind, a cosmic act of generosity that also sparks divine jealousy. It's a story that feels strangely familiar, echoing later myths like Prometheus bringing fire or Eve tasting knowledge. You could almost say that the Sumerians started that entire narrative tradition, the idea that knowledge, though divine, was meant to be shared. A small but delightful historical fact: archaeologists have unearthed Sumerian administrative tablets that detail deliveries of reeds, bricks, and beer to temple workers for the House of Enki. It's essentially the world's oldest work order. The gods, it seems, were not just worshipped, but also supplied. Some modern historians chuckle that ancient temples functioned as both spiritual centers and early forms of bureaucracy. But in myth, those deliveries had meaning. The bricks were for the homes of the gods on earth, the Ziggurats, the first mountains built by human hands. Each layer of those temples was thought to mirror the heavens, creating a stairway between realms. When priests climbed to the top to pray, they weren't reaching for the sky metaphorically. They believed they were ascending toward the literal domain of the Anunnaki. The connection between heaven and earth was intimate, direct, and fragile. The Anunnaki could bless or curse with a gesture. They controlled the waters that nourished life, and the same waters could destroy. When the Tigris flooded gently, it was Enki's mercy. When it surged too high, it was Enlil's wrath. Even in myth, the gods mirrored the unpredictable reality of life in Mesopotamia. As the stars wheeled above the plains, the people built their shrines and lit their lamps. The Anunnaki, they believed, watched from both above and among them, guiding, judging, teaching, and sometimes simply observing. And in that shimmering space between reverence and fear, civilization took root. Humanity learned to live not only for survival, but in relationship with the unseen. It was the first partnership, fragile, imperfect, and profoundly human, between earth and the heavens. High above the clouds, where the air thins into silence, the Sumerians believed there sat Anu, the father of all gods, the supreme ruler of the heavens. To the people of Mesopotamia, Anu wasn't just a name written in cuneiform. He was the ultimate authority, the unseen framework of the universe. When lightning flashed, or when kings rose and fell, it was said that his gaze had shifted, a quiet cosmic acknowledgement that the divine order had been tested, or perhaps reaffirmed. Beneath him, ruling the air and earth, stood his son Enlil, the god of wind, storms, and command. If Anu represented the unreachable vastness of the sky, Enlil was its breath, invisible yet present in every grain of dust stirred by the breeze. Together, father and son formed the core of divine power, one ruled by stillness, the other by motion. The ancient hymns describe Anu as remote and untouchable. He rarely descended, rarely intervened. His was a reign of cosmic delegation. He granted power, but did not wield it directly. The sky, after all, was perfect as it was. Enlil, on the other hand, was active, restless, and often unpredictable. He carried the authority of command, the one who enforced the laws of heaven upon the earth. The people called him the Great Mountain, for his strength and his unshakable presence. In the mythic order of things, Anu was the concept of kingship itself, the divine legitimacy that earthly rulers sought to mirror. Every Sumerian king claimed his right to rule by the word of Anu. It was a kind of divine franchise system, if you will, where kings were local managers of a heavenly enterprise. You could say Anu was the ultimate CEO, patient, silent, but whose approval decided everything. One mainstream historical fact makes this relationship even more fascinating. In Sumerian political life, power was always divided between heaven and earth. City-states had dual authorities, a Lugal, or secular king, and an En, or priestly ruler. That mirrored the cosmic hierarchy: Anu in heaven, Enlil on earth. The divine pattern became a political model. Society itself was shaped like the heavens. But the myths also tell us that Enlil's rule wasn't always kind. He was the enforcer of divine law, the one who separated heaven from earth, light from darkness, and sometimes mercy from justice. He could bless, but he could also curse. One legend describes Enlil's impatience with humanity's noise. As the population grew and cities flourished, people's constant prayers and complaints became overwhelming. Enlil, unable to bear the clamor, decided to bring silence with a flood. That act would later echo through the famous flood stories of Babylon and the Bible. Historians still argue whether the Great Flood of Sumer was inspired by a real event, perhaps a catastrophic river overflow around 2900 BCE, or purely allegorical. Either way, the myth of Enlil's flood became one of the earliest reflections on divine justice. Why do the gods punish what they themselves have created? The myth also paints a vivid contrast between Enlil and his brother Enki, the clever god of wisdom and water. When Enlil decided humanity must be erased, Enki secretly whispered to one man, Zusidara, telling him to build a great boat. That small act of rebellion preserved humankind and sowed eternal tension between the two gods. But before all that came to pass, there was an age of divine harmony, the May of heaven firmly established, the Anunnaki working together to build a world worth inhabiting. Anu remained in the celestial realm known as the High Heaven, while Enlil took command over the Middle Heaven, the space of air and weather, the bridge between gods and men. The Sumerians pictured Enlil's dwelling as a great temple called Ekur, the mountain house. It wasn't built on any real mountain, since the flat Mesopotamian plains had none, but the Ziggurats served as its symbolic replacement. When priests climbed its steps, they said they were entering the domain of Enlil himself. Inside, offerings of dates, honey, and barley beer awaited him, a godly meal meant to please his tempestuous mood. And yet even Enlil was bound by order. Above him, Anu's decrees were absolute. One hymn calls Anu's words unalterable fate. The Sumerians didn't believe in coincidence. Everything had its divine cause, and Anu's realm was where those causes began. Even the other gods would kneel before him when a decision had to be made. One particularly curious detail appears on later Akkadian tablets. Anu's symbol was not a face, nor a creature, but a star, often a single 8-pointed one. To the Sumerians, that star represented the high heavens, the unreachable realm of divine intellect. Some modern researchers have pointed out that this same 8-pointed symbol appears across cultures, from Sumer to Assyria, from Persia to even early Christian iconography. Coincidence or inheritance? Historians still debate whether the Star of Anu influenced later religious imagery, or whether it simply expressed a universal awe for the heavens. And then there's a more fringe tidbit, a line of thought popularized by speculative historians. They point to Sumerian depictions of the gods with winged helmets and rod-like tools, interpreting them as evidence that the Anunnaki might have been something more technological than divine. According to this idea, Anu wasn't just the god of the sky, he was of the sky, perhaps literally arriving from beyond it. Traditional scholars, of course, dismiss this as mythic symbolism. The wings represent divine mobility, not mechanical flight. But even they admit there's something oddly specific about the consistency of those images across thousands of years. Still, what remains undeniable is the way Anu and Enlil became archetypes that lasted millennia. When Babylon rose, their names evolved into Anum and Enlil. When Assyria followed, their essence became woven into the fabric of later gods like Ashur and Marduk. You can even trace echoes of Anu's aloof authority and Enlil's stormy command in the later depictions of Zeus or Yahweh. Sky fathers ruling from above, distant yet decisive. Back in Sumer, though, these gods were not abstract concepts. They were daily presences. The wind that carried the smell of barley fields, that was Enlil. The soft night breeze across a Ziggurat's terrace, that was his whisper. And when a storm cracked the horizon, it wasn't random thunder. It was the voice of authority itself, rumbling over the land to remind humanity who truly ruled the world. In time, the priests would say that Anu and Enlil were the first to divide heaven and earth. Not as a punishment, but as a gift. They separated chaos from order, sky from soil, and made room for life to grow. And in that small act of divine structure, civilization found its rhythm. Beneath the great plains of Sumer, below the riverbeds and the cities rising above them, lay the Abzu, a boundless sea of fresh, sacred water. To the Sumerians, it was the hidden source of life, the eternal reservoir feeding every well, canal, and stream. And in that silent, shimmering deep dwelled one of the most beloved and complex of all the Anunnaki, Enki, the god of water, wisdom, and creation. Where his brother Enlil ruled the air with command and storm, Enki ruled the depths with laughter and craft. He was a god of cleverness, not conquest, the kind of deity who solved problems with wit instead of wrath. His temples were filled not with thunderous chants, but with the quiet murmur of scholars, scribes, and priests copying tablets. He was the friend of humankind, the one who listened. It was Enki, they said, who first imagined the idea of life itself. Long ago, before the first reeds swayed along the rivers and before the first city's bricks were laid, the Anunnaki faced a dilemma. The world was forming, rivers flowing, winds moving, crops growing, yet it required endless labor. The canals needed dredging, the fields sowing, the temples maintaining. Even gods, it seemed, could grow tired. In one myth, the lesser gods, called the Igigi, groaned beneath this toil. They dug rivers and raised mounds for ages without rest, until one night, in exhaustion and rebellion, they surrounded Enlil's house, demanding release. It was then that Enki, watching from his watery domain, offered a solution both brilliant and dangerous. He would create a new being, one capable of work, but also of thought and spirit. The tablets described the scene with poetic detail. Enki called upon Ninhursag, the mother goddess, and together they gathered clay from the banks of the Abzu. Into that clay, Enki mixed divine essence. Some say the blood of a slain god, others say the breath of the waters themselves. With sacred incantations, they molded figures in human form, soft and unsteady, fragile yet alive. Thus, humanity was born. Historians still argue whether this myth represents an allegory for the rise of agriculture, humanity shaped from clay as a metaphor for settling and tilling the earth, or whether it's a spiritual explanation of our divine origins. Whatever the truth, the story reveals a profound idea for its time, that humans were co-creations, part earth, part divine. Yet, there was a twist. According to some versions, Enki's creation was not entirely approved by Enlil. The ruler of air saw humanity as noisy, flawed, and unpredictable, too much like the gods themselves. But Enki, ever the rebel, defended his work. He argued that the gods needed beings who could love, wonder, and create, not just labor. It's a debate that feels oddly modern. Efficiency versus empathy, order versus freedom. In one of the oldest surviving texts, known as the Enki and Ninmah myth, Enki tests the limits of his creation. He and the goddess Ninmah drink beer, apparently divine creativity improves after a few pints, and begin forming different kinds of humans, one with shaky limbs, another unable to speak, another blind. Each one, Enki declares, still has a purpose. The blind man, he says, will learn to sing. The lame will become a wise counselor. It's one of the earliest expressions of inclusion in mythology, that even imperfection has meaning. And yes, that little mention of divine beer isn't poetic fancy. It's historically accurate. Archaeologists have found ancient hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing, describing the process of fermentation in rhythmic verse. It's both a recipe and a prayer, suggesting that even divine creation might have benefited from a good craft beverage. In the great temple of Eridu, the oldest known temple on Earth, Enki was worshipped as the giver of wisdom, Priests called him Lord of the Sweet Waters, Master of Crafts, and He who knows all things. Offerings of honey, dates, and fish were left at his altars, and in return, his blessings were said to flow like rivers: creativity, intelligence, invention. The temple itself stood on layers of older shrines, rebuilt and expanded over centuries. Archaeologists have unearthed 20 successive foundations there, as if each generation kept trying to reach deeper into Enki's realm. Beneath it all lies the oldest layer, simple mud brick and reed, dating to around 5400 BCE. Imagine that, a temple to wisdom, built 2,000 years before the pyramids even existed. Among the May, the divine decrees of civilization, Enki was said to hold dominion over things like writing, law, music, and metallurgy. In one tale, he bestows these gifts upon humankind, ferrying them up the Euphrates in a boat shaped like a shining crescent. Yet, as with all divine generosity, trouble followed. The goddess Inanna, ambitious and radiant, visits Enki in his palace and charms him with drink. When he grows merry, he gives her the sacred May without hesitation. The next morning, he realizes what he's done and sends his creatures to retrieve them. But Inanna escapes, laughing, carrying civilization to her city of Uruk. That playful exchange, wisdom shared, stolen, and spread, feels almost like an allegory for culture itself. Knowledge wants to move. It doesn't stay contained, even by gods. Some modern researchers have pointed out that Enki's myths carry echoes of a scientific mindset. He's the god who experiments, adapts, and seeks understanding rather than dominance. A few fringe interpreters even call him the engineer of humanity, suggesting he represents the archetype of a divine scientist, the one who creates through learning. Traditional scholars, however, emphasize that Enki's knowledge was moral and spiritual as much as practical. Wisdom was sacred balance, not mere intellect. Still, it's striking how often Enki's character defies the mold of his peers. While Enlil commands through fear, Enki persuades through curiosity. While others demand worship, he offers guidance. In myths, he laughs often, drinks freely, and intervenes subtly to help humankind survive the wrath of stricter gods. You could say he's the universe's favorite uncle, brilliant, a little mischievous, but always looking out for you. And yet, Enki's compassion comes with weight. By giving humans life, he also gives them burden, work, knowledge, the capacity for error. The Sumerians believed that to be wise was to carry sorrow, because awareness of balance also meant awareness of loss. It's a truth that still resonates. To understand the world deeply is to know its fragility. As the rivers flowed from his domain, the people built canals and irrigation systems, mirroring the god's mastery of water. When they drew up blueprints for cities, they believed they were copying Enki's original plan, the divine design of harmony between land and water. You can still see it in aerial maps of ancient Sumer. Cities built beside curving channels, shaped almost like flowing script. At night, when the oil lamps flickered along those waters, perhaps a few dreamers looked toward the darkness beyond the reeds and wondered if Enki's realm was still there, a hidden sea beneath the earth, filled with light and laughter. They couldn't prove it, but they didn't need to. The rivers themselves were proof enough. Long before temples pierced the sky and kings carved their names into stone, there was Ninhursag, the Great Mother, the Lady of the Mountain, the womb of all that lives. Her name, in the language of Sumer, meant Lady of the Sacred Hills, though in truth she needed no mountain to stand tall. To the ancient people, she was the earth itself, rich, breathing, and eternal. If Enki was the mind that imagined life, Ninhursag was the hands that made it real. Together they formed the oldest partnership in myth, intellect and nurture, reason and compassion. In clay they found the meeting point of heaven and earth, and so they shaped humankind. The story unfolds in the dim, hushed world beneath the stars. The gods gather near the waters of the Abzu, where Enki's palace gleams faintly in the dark. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth, that sweet mineral smell that comes just before rain. Ninhursag kneels by the shore, her fingers dipping into the mud. She mixes it with sacred water and chants softly in a language older than memory. Her voice, the Sumerians said, was the heartbeat of the land. From that clay she molds figures, one by one, careful, deliberate. Enki stands beside her, guiding her hands, whispering secret words of vitality. And then, when the forms are ready, Ninhursag bends low, breathes gently upon them, and gives them life. That breath, the Z, became the Sumerian word for spirit. To breathe was to live. To stop was to return to dust. Every human, they believed, carried a spark of the goddess's own vitality. She did not just create them, she invested herself in them. This, according to the tablets, is how the first people came to be. They were not born from the void or summoned from divine fire. They were crafted, patiently, like art. It's an image at once tender and intimate, the mother goddess with her hands in the mud, sculpting the shape of humankind. Historians still argue whether this story was meant as theology or as a poetic reflection of agriculture itself, the idea that life comes from the union of soil and water. To plant a seed in the earth, after all, is to repeat the act of Ninhursag. Even today, when farmers in southern Iraq press their fingers into the mud, they echo that same motion, perhaps unknowingly honoring her. One of the most charming, almost humorous myths involving Ninhursag tells how she once had to save Enki from himself. According to the tale, Enki, ever curious, ever meddling, consumed the sacred plants of wisdom that were meant for the gods alone. As punishment, his body became ill, each organ racked with pain. Ninhursag, furious yet compassionate, created a series of healing deities, one for each part of his body, to restore him. When he was finally cured, balance returned to the world. The story may sound light-hearted, but it carried deep meaning. The Sumerians saw in it a reflection of nature's cycle, imbalance followed by renewal, harm followed by healing. Even gods, it seemed, could make mistakes, and even the earth could forgive. There's an old Sumerian hymn that praises Ninhursag as she who nurtures all life, who gives suck to kings and beggars alike, whose milk is the river that never dries. In a way, she was both creator and caretaker, but also, at times, destroyer. For the Sumerians understood that nature is generous yet unpredictable. The same soil that grows wheat can also swallow a village in flood. The goddess of life was not always gentle. In her temples, worship was more personal than political. Offerings of grain, milk, and dates were left in quiet devotion. Women in childbirth prayed to her for strength. Farmers asked her to bless the soil. Some clay figurines unearthed by archaeologists show her seated on a throne flanked by lions, serene, powerful, maternal. Others depict a simpler image, a woman nursing a child, symbolizing life's first dependency. And then there's a curious archaeological detail. In some early Sumerian graves, Small clay figures shaped like fetuses were found beside the dead. Scholars still debate their meaning. Were they tokens of rebirth, promises of new life in another world, or symbols of returning to the care of the goddess who first molded them? No one knows for certain. But in the myths, Ninhursag's role extended far beyond the first creation. She was called upon to renew the world after the flood sent by Enlil, to repopulate the earth, to heal its wounds. In that sense, she was timeless. Not a single mother, but motherhood itself, ever repeating, ever forgiving. A fringe interpretation, whispered in the corners of ancient astronaut theories, claims that the clay of Ninhursag was not literal soil, but a metaphor for genetics, that the breath of life referred to a kind of advanced intervention. Most historians dismiss this idea as modern myth-making, but it's fascinating how enduring the language of creation remains. Whether through sacred hands or scientific instruments, humanity has always sought a story for how life began. In one of the more philosophical Sumerian poems, Ninhursag looks upon her creations and speaks to Enki. They are fragile as reeds, yet their hearts will endure storms. They will build temples to us, and they will forget us. Still, they will live. There's something profoundly human in those words, a recognition that imperfection is the very proof of life. A historical fact adds weight to her legend. In the city of Adab, archaeologists found one of the earliest known statues of a ruling woman, perhaps a priestess, perhaps a queen, wearing a robe patterned like mountain ridges. Some scholars believe it represents Ninhursag's influence on real-world authority, the idea that women too could embody divine strength. It's a rare and beautiful reminder that in humanity's earliest civilization, creation itself had a woman's face. As centuries passed, her name would change to Ki, to Nintu, to Aruru, but her essence remained. The breath of life that once stirred clay now moved through every living being. When a child took its first cry, when crops sprouted after rain, when rivers returned after drought, the people would say, "Ninhursag breathes again." And perhaps she still does. The wind through tall reeds, the smell of wet soil after rain, those are her quiet reminders, ancient as time, that life was never an accident, but a conversation between creation and care. There was once an age, the Sumerians said, when gods and mortals walked the same streets. The air shimmered with divinity, yet life went on. Farmers still sowed, potters still turned their wheels, and merchants still haggled in the markets. But in every sound, from the bleating of goats to the hum of prayers, the presence of the Anunnaki lingered like a second heartbeat beneath the land. It was a time later generations called the Golden Age of the Gods. Not golden in the sense of luxury or perfection, but because everything, life, labor, worship, seemed touched by light. The gods were near, and the cities of Sumer, their chosen homes, thrived. Across the wide Mesopotamian plain, rivers snaked like silver ribbons under the sun. Along their banks rose great cities, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Nippur, each dedicated to its own divine patron. The people didn't just build for themselves, they built for the gods. Temples rose at the centers of their cities, massive stepped towers reaching toward the sky, the first Ziggurats, the meeting points of heaven and earth. From above, if one could have flown across the land, those temples would have gleamed like constellations reflected on earth. At night their torches burned long after the rest of the city slept, a sign that the divine never rested. In this age, the gods were not remote. They dined in the temples, attended ceremonies, and according to myth, even ruled alongside kings. One ancient text, the Sumerian king list, records that kingship descended from heaven. The very first rulers were said to be chosen, or perhaps created, by the gods themselves. Their reigns were impossibly long, 10,000 years, then 8,000, then 5,000. Historians still argue whether those numbers are symbolic or records of dynasties remembered as singular divine beings. Yet beneath the myth there's a grain of truth. Archaeologists have indeed uncovered evidence of the earliest monarchies here, rulers who called themselves servants of the gods. The temple and the palace were often the same building. Politics and piety were indistinguishable. To govern was to mediate between humans and heaven. The people of Sumer saw their world as a carefully tended garden, with the gods as gardeners. But unlike the later myths of Paradise Lost, this garden wasn't perfect. It was dynamic, alive with festivals, songs, and stories that celebrated not only divine power, but human creativity. Every city had its own patron god, and with them came its own identity. Uruk, for instance, was the domain of Inanna, goddess of love and war, a city of vibrancy and ambition. Eridu, ancient and wise, belonged to Enki, a place of deep wells and quiet scholars. Nippur, seat of Enlil, was the spiritual capital where the fate of all lands was thought to be written. And everywhere, life moved to the rhythm of the rivers. The Sumerians were masters of irrigation, digging canals and controlling floods with astonishing precision. Some historians credit them with inventing the very idea of civil engineering. Yet when you read their hymns, they never took credit themselves. It is by the will of Enki, they wrote, that water flows and barley grows. Even their technology was divine collaboration. In the marketplace, the lines between sacred and ordinary blurred further. Merchants invoked Inanna before risky voyages. Scribes asked Nabu to bless their tablets, and musicians played songs written for the gods as people danced to them in the streets. The divine wasn't confined to temples. It pulsed through every corner of daily life. One tablet, discovered near Ur, describes a festival known as the Akiti, a celebration marking the new year and the renewal of the land. People filled the streets with laughter, beer, and music. The gods were said to walk invisibly among them, disguised as travelers or guests. For one night each year, all social divisions, priest and farmer, king and laborer, dissolved. Everyone shared food and drink, as if the heavens themselves had descended to dine. And in a sense, they had. The Anunnaki were said to visit their cities regularly. When storms passed, people believed Enlil had walked through the sky. When rivers overflowed, Enki had stirred in his sleep. When the moon gleamed bright and low, Nanna had risen from his shrine. The world was alive with signs, and the people read them constantly. Historians still debate whether this period, roughly between 3000 and 2500 BCE, truly represented the birth of organized religion or something even older, a continuation of an instinct to find spirit in all things. The temples, the rituals, the songs, they may have been new, but the feeling behind them was as old as humanity itself. A curious tidbit from archaeology adds texture to this picture. In Uruk, excavators found thousands of small clay tokens shaped like animals, jars, and tools. They were used for accounting, an early form of bookkeeping. But some of the tokens bear tiny carvings of gods or celestial symbols, as though even in tracking grain and goods, the Sumerians wanted divine oversight. The gods were part-time auditors, it seems. Still, not everything was harmonious. The same closeness that made the divine accessible also made it volatile. When drought struck or crops failed, people feared it was punishment, that they had offended their city's patron. To restore favor, priests performed complex rituals, singing hymns, washing statues of the gods, burning incense and pouring sweet wine on altars. The gods had to be cared for, indulged, and at times soothed. There's an old Sumerian saying carved on a tablet: "A hungry god is an angry god." Offerings weren't symbolic, they were vital. The temple stored grain, oil, and livestock, wealth both spiritual and material. In a way, the gods were the economy. Without them, the city would starve. Yet this dependency didn't breed fear alone. It created a sense of partnership. People saw themselves as essential to the gods' world, not mere subjects, but caretakers. The gods gave rain and wisdom, humans gave devotion and craft. Together they sustained the cycle. In one poetic fragment, a scribe describes this age in gentle wonder. The fields sang with grain, the rivers carried laughter, and the gods walked in the cool of evening. It's an image that lingers, soft, glowing, dreamlike. The Sumerians may not have had the word utopia, but they lived by its rhythm for a time. Civilization, after all, began not with conquest, but with collaboration between mortals and myths, hands and heavens. And though the golden age would eventually fade, its echo still lives in every story we tell about harmony between the human and the divine. The rains began as a whisper, a soft patter against clay roofs and temple steps, the kind of drizzle that usually brought relief to the parched lands of Sumer. But that night, the air felt heavier, the clouds lower, and the wind had a strange, restless hum. In the old stories, people would later say that even the goats refused to settle, and the birds had flown inland hours before the first thunder rolled. The flood, the great deluge of Sumer, did not arrive with warning trumpets or divine ceremony. It came quietly, almost kindly at first, as though the heavens were merely weeping. But by dawn, the tears had turned to wrath. In the tablets of Eridu and Nippur, the story unfolds in solemn rhythm. There was a time when humankind grew too loud, too proud. The gods, weary of sleepless nights from the endless noise of mortals, decided to begin anew. Their clamor, one fragment reads, was like the buzzing of flies. To the divine, human life had become a nuisance, not evil, merely inconvenient. It was Enlil, lord of air and command, who first suggested the flood. He wanted silence restored, a clean slate upon which the gods could rewrite creation. But Enki, god of wisdom and water, hesitated. Mortals were his creation, shaped by his own hands from clay and divine breath. He could not bear to see them all erased. So, the tale says, he chose one man, Zusudra, the faithful king of Shurupak. Some versions call him a priest, others a humble man of piety, but all agree he was righteous and attentive to dreams. One night, as he slept by the river, Enki spoke to him, not directly, for that would have defied the counsel of gods, but through a whisper carried in the rush of water. Reed wall, listen to me. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon possessions. Seek life. Bring seed of every creature. Ziggurats awoke trembling. The next morning he told no one what he had heard. Instead, he gathered his family, his craftsmen, and began to build. The structure rose quickly. Not a simple raft, but a grand vessel sealed with pitch as wide as it was long. He loaded it with grains, animals, and tools, all while the city mocked him. What flood could come to Shuruppak, a city so far from the sea? Then the skies broke. For 7 days and 7 nights the storm raged without pause. The Tigris and Euphrates swelled beyond their banks, swallowing fields and homes. Lightning carved white scars across the horizon. Even the gods, so the myths claim, fled to the highest heavens, frightened by their own creation. Like a woman in labor, says one ancient line, the goddess wailed. Ninhursag, the mother of life, grieved for her children. Why did I decree destruction for my own people? Why did I command death for those I bore? Down below, Ziggurats' ark rose and fell with the waves. He watched as his city disappeared beneath the waters, the Ziggurat spire vanishing last, as though the heavens themselves were closing a door. Days passed without sun or moon. Inside the ark, the air was thick and still, broken only by the sounds of restless animals and whispered prayers. Then, on the 7th day, silence. The storm ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Ziggurats opened a small window, and a shaft of pale light fell across his face. He wept, not for himself, but for the world that was gone. The ark drifted for many days until it came to rest upon a mountain. Some say Mount Nisr, others Mount Judy. Ziggurats released a dove. It flew off, circled, and returned. He sent a swallow. It too came back. Finally, he released a raven, and it did not return. Then he knew the waters were receding. He stepped out into a silent world, washed clean. The ground was soft, the air fresh, and the horizon shimmered with possibility. There Ziggurats built an altar and offered sacrifices of sweet wood and grain. The smoke rose in spirals towards the heavens. The gods, drawn by the scent, descended once more. Enlil saw the smoke and was furious. "Who has escaped?" he demanded. "Who defied my command?" But Enki stepped forward, calm as ever, and said, "It was not defiance, it was mercy. One seed of life remained, and through it the world can begin again." Perhaps realizing the futility of rage, Enlil relented. He approached Ziggurats and laid a hand upon his head. "You shall not die as other men," he said. "You shall dwell in Dilmun, the land of the living, at the mouth of the rivers." And so Ziggurats became immortal, carried to a place where the sun rises, a paradise beyond mortal reach. To modern ears, the story sounds familiar. It echoes through time, reshaped into the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero is renamed Utnapishtim, and later still into the Book of Genesis, where Noah takes his place on the ark. Scholars still argue whether these are shared memories of an actual flood or mythic metaphors for renewal. There was a great flood, at least according to geological evidence. Around 2900 BCE, layers of silt and destruction mark a massive inundation across Mesopotamia. Whether it inspired the myth or was explained by it remains uncertain. But the Sumerians were not chronicling apocalypse. They were meditating on cycles, destruction and rebirth, silence and sound, wrath and forgiveness, the endless balancing act between gods and men. A curious tidbit survives in a lesser-known tablet. After the flood, when the land began to dry, people noticed fish caught high in trees and boats resting miles inland. Children asked their elders, "Did the river climb to the sky?" And the elders, still shaken, would only say, "Perhaps the sky came down to the river." In time, cities rose again. Temples were rebuilt, the fields were replanted. But something had changed. The intimacy between gods and humans, once so close, now carried a shadow of caution. The flood had redrawn the line between divine and mortal, and for the first time, humankind learned what it meant to be fragile. Yet they also learned endurance. For even as they rebuilt, they sang songs to the gods, songs of gratitude and awe. "You washed away the old, so that the new might bloom," one hymn proclaims. The flood had not ended the story, it had cleansed the canvas. And in the quiet that followed, the rivers ran gentler, the temples stood taller, and life, stubborn, resilient, and sacred, began again. When the waters finally withdrew, the land that emerged was not the same as before. The great flood had smoothed the plains and buried the old world beneath layers of silt and silence. Yet in that stillness, life stirred again. The rivers found their channels, the reeds grew tall along their banks, and human voices, hesitant at first, began to echo once more across the valleys. The Sumerians said this was when kingship descended from heaven once more. Civilization was reborn, not as a continuation, but as a divine restart. The gods, satisfied that the earth had been cleansed, looked down upon the survivors and said, "Let there be order again." It began in Kish, a city near the middle reaches of the Euphrates. There the people crowned a new ruler, a man said to have been chosen by Anu himself. His name was Inanna, the shepherd king, remembered as the man who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the lands. His story, preserved on broken tablets, tells how he sought the plant of birth to grant him a son, and in his quest he befriended an eagle that carried him high above the clouds. Whether or not Inanna truly flew, the myth carried a message. Kingship was not mere authority, it was a sacred link between heaven and earth. To rule was to bridge worlds, to listen to the divine will and shape human life accordingly. In the new era, the gods were no longer said to live openly among mortals. They ruled through intermediaries, kings and priests, who served as their voices. The Anunnaki had withdrawn to their celestial realms, but their presence lingered in temples, rituals, and the steady rhythm of power. The Sumerian king list, that strange and haunting document carved onto ancient tablets, preserves this transition in its own cryptic way. It begins with the simple declaration: after the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered again from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Then it proceeds to list monarchs who ruled for impossible spans, 1,200 years, 900 years, 1,560 years, reigns that stretch beyond reason. Historians still argue whether these numbers reflect mythic exaggeration or symbolic measures of dynastic power. But what's clear is that the Sumerians believed something divine had once walked within their rulers. The kings were not gods themselves, but extensions of divine will, partners in maintaining balance between chaos and order. In the early post-flood cities, archaeologists found traces of an expanding world, new irrigation canals, trade routes stretching towards the Persian Gulf, and records of goods from distant lands, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, copper from Oman. Civilization was not just returning, it was spreading, ambitious, and interconnected. At the heart of every new city rose the temple once again, the Ikur of Nippur, the Inanna of Uruk, the Iabzu of Eridu, each one a house for a god, each one echoing the shape of a mountain reaching for the sky. Priests became administrators, stewards of divine property, and keepers of celestial order. They recorded offerings, measured grain, and chanted hymns that stitched human life to divine rhythm. And in every temple archive, one phrase appeared over and over: "For the god, by the hand of the king." The kings were expected not just to rule, but to build canals, temples, walls, all acts of devotion. Power in Sumer was sacred labor. A monarch who neglected his temples risked more than rebellion. He risked divine abandonment. A quirky detail survives in a fragment from Lagash. One ruler claimed he was chosen by Ninhursag, the city's warrior god, to bring justice and relieve the poor from oppression. He introduced what may be the world's first recorded legal reforms, banning debt slavery and temple corruption. Some scholars half-jokingly call him the first social reformer. Whether or not the reforms worked, the attempt speaks volumes. Kingship was not just about wealth and war, but morality. And yet, morality could be a double-edged staff. The same divine authority that sanctified compassion could also justify conquest. As cities grew and competed, kings invoked their gods to claim dominion over others. When Kish's power waned, Uruk rose under Enmerkar and Lugal-Banda, both said to have divine favor. Their successor Gilgamesh would later become legend, half god, half man, restless and proud. But that story still waits on the horizon. For now, the age of kingship was still new and gleaming. The people looked to their rulers with reverence, believing their prosperity reflected the god's pleasure. If canals flowed smoothly, the king was righteous. If drought struck, he must have erred. The king's prayers were the people's protection. In Nippur, the priests of Enlil maintained the cosmic calendar, aligning rituals with the stars. They watched the constellations, the bowl of heaven, the great twins, the lion, and declared the seasons. Farmers depended on these readings as much as on their own hands. Astronomy, agriculture, and worship were threads of the same loom. Historians still debate how much of this was truly divine kingship and how much was political theater. Were these rulers sincere believers, or savvy administrators cloaking power in holiness? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Power, faith, and fear. In ancient Sumer, these were inseparable forces. Yet amid all the grandeur, human tenderness persisted. One recovered inscription from Uruk praises a king not for his conquests, but for rebuilding a temple's gardens. It says, "He made the willows grow by the canal, and the doves returned to nest there." It's a small thing, the kind of detail that reminds us that even among gods and kings, someone noticed the sound of wings in the reeds. The Anunnaki, though distant now, still watched. Their statues in the temples, carved from gleaming stone and adorned with gold leaf, gazed down with eyes of inlaid shell and lapis lazuli, as if seeing both the world and beyond it. Offerings piled before them, bowls of dates, jars of honey, cups of fresh milk. The priests murmured prayers to keep the divine favor steady, to prevent another flood, another silence. And as night fell over the reborn cities, the people gathered outside their homes, looking up at the stars, those ancient pinpricks of light that mirrored the gods' eternal counsel. Somewhere above, the Anunnaki were said to meet, deciding which king would rise, which would fall, and how long this fragile balance between heaven and earth would hold. For now, it held. The flood had washed away one world, but from its silt another had bloomed, organized, luminous, and watchful. Humanity had rebuilt under divine eyes, and the rhythm of civilization began to beat once more, slow and steady, beneath the starlit plains of Sumer. In the heart of Uruk, as dawn spread its first pale light across the Ziggurat terraces, the priests lit incense and sang the name of Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, daughter of the moon god Nanna, and perhaps the most vivid, unpredictable presence in all of Sumerian myth. Her statues gleamed with gold leaf, her eyes made of lapis and shell. To some, she was the morning star, bright and bold. To others, the evening star, fading and fierce. And to all, she was a mystery, radiant, terrifying, and utterly alive. Inanna's temples, especially her great Inanna, house of heaven in Uruk, were said to pulse with beauty and danger. Offerings of perfumes, beer, and pomegranates filled her altars. Musicians played lyres and drums, their rhythms echoing through the city streets. For Inanna was not a goddess to be worshipped in silence. She was the spirit of love, of war, of fertile fields, and burning desire. She could bless a harvest or ignite a conflict. She could cradle the newborn or bring ruin to a city. To love her is to dance on the edge of the storm, one old priest once said, probably with a weary sigh of experience. The myths tell that Inanna's power was unlike any other. While Anu ruled the heavens and Enlil commanded the winds, it was Inanna who moved hearts and nations. She desired experience in all its forms: passion, triumph, jealousy, grief. In one myth, she travels to Eridu to visit Enki, god of wisdom, and through charm and wit persuades him, or perhaps tricks him, into gifting her the me, the sacred laws and powers that define civilization. They include kingship, music, truth, weaving, and even deceit. Enki, realizing what has happened, sends creatures to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes, bringing the gifts to Uruk. Thus, civilization itself, its culture, its art, its contradictions, became part of her legacy. Historians still argue whether this tale represents a symbolic transfer of cultural power from Eridu to Uruk, or simply a divine lesson about cleverness triumphing over control. Either way, it paints Inanna as a goddess who would not be contained. Her stories, however, are not all of conquest. One of the most haunting and beautiful myths in Sumerian lore tells of her descent into the underworld. It begins not with rage or curiosity, but with longing. Inanna hears of the funeral rites of her sister, Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. Wanting to know the great below as she knows the great above, Inanna prepares herself for the journey. She adorns her body with symbols of power: crown, earrings, beads, breastplate, and robe, and sets out through the 7 gates of the underworld. At each gate, she is forced to remove one item: her crown at the first, her earrings at the second, and so on, until by the 7th gate she stands naked and bowed. There, before Ereshkigal, Inanna is judged, struck down, and hung upon a hook like a piece of meat. For 3 days and 3 nights, her body hangs lifeless in the land of the dead. The world above grows barren, crops fail, animals cease to breed, and love itself seems to vanish. Then, through the cunning of Enki, 2 small creatures made of clay descend to rescue her. They weep with Ereshkigal, echoing her cries, and the queen of the underworld, moved by their sympathy, grants them the water and food of life to restore Inanna. The goddess rises. She returns through the gates, piece by piece reclaiming her garments of power, and the world blooms again. Yet there is a price. No one may leave the underworld unclaimed. Inanna must send another in her place. When she returns to Uruk, she finds her husband Dumazi sitting comfortably on his throne, dressed in finery, seemingly unmoved by her absence. Her fury is cold and absolute. She commands, "Take him, let him descend in my stead." And so Dumazi is seized and carried below. But later, her heart softens, and she decrees that he will spend half the year in the underworld and half in the world above. A rhythm of death and renewal that would echo through all later myths of seasonal change. The earth's fertility, the turning of time itself, became a reflection of Inanna's descent and return. To the Sumerians, this was more than a story. It was a cycle they lived by. Every spring, the fields revived. Inanna ascended. Every harvest, the world grew still. Inanna descended. Her myth became a calendar, her passion a cosmic pulse. Archaeological evidence of her worship paints a vivid picture. Thousands of small votive figures have been found, many of women with clasped hands or stylized eyes uplifted in prayer. Some scholars suggest that her priestesses performed rituals embodying her journey, dressing in elaborate robes, then removing them one by one in symbolic surrender before donning them again in triumph. The echoes of those rites may even have influenced later Near Eastern fertility rituals and sacred performances. One fringe but fascinating theory claims that Inanna was once an actual historical figure, a deified queen of Uruk, whose charisma and legend grew until myth consumed memory. There's no proof, of course, but the idea lingers, a reminder of how easily history and divinity intertwined in the ancient world. Even today, Inanna's image feels strangely modern. She defies simplicity, both lover and warrior, nurturer and destroyer, ruler and rebel. Her hymn, one of the oldest surviving poems in the world, praises her in words that still vibrate with life. Lady of largest heart, clothed in radiance, you are exalted, Inanna. You roar like a lion. There's power in that, raw, unapologetic, and deeply human. Perhaps that's why she endures. She wasn't the goddess of perfection, but of transformation, of burning and blooming again. Historians still debate what Inanna represented most: fertility, political might, the planet Venus, or simply the spirit of life itself. But maybe that's the point. She refused to be one thing, and in doing so, she became everything. As night fell in Uruk, the people gathered on rooftops to watch the evening star shimmer into view, the planet Venus rising above the plain. To them, that light was Inanna's eye, watching, daring, radiant. Somewhere, she was descending or ascending, always in motion, forever cycling between worlds. And under her watch, love returned, the earth breathed again, and the story of humanity, fragile, passionate, and endlessly renewing, continued. The morning after Inanna's return from the underworld, so the old songs say, the world felt new again. Dew shimmered across the barley fields, the rivers ran clear, and the people of Sumer sang songs of gratitude, not only for life restored, but for what the gods had taught them. For in those years after the flood and the descent, the Anunnaki became more than distant overseers. They became teachers, shaping the fragile human world into something enduring. The Sumerians believed that civilization itself, the tools, trades, and truths that defined a people, was no human invention. It was a gift. The gods, moved perhaps by pity or pride, had descended once more to guide the scattered survivors. From their hands came the blueprints of society, carved not on paper, but in memory and clay. From Enki, Lord of Wisdom, came irrigation and writing. It was said that he shaped the first reed stylus from the marshes of Eridu and pressed the signs into wet clay, teaching humans how to remember beyond speech. The earliest tablets, lists of barley, sheep, and beer, were not proems or prophecies, but ledgers. Yet in those humble markings lay the seed of storytelling itself. From Ninhursag, the mother goddess, came the arts of medicine and midwifery. She who gives life also mends it, the priests would say. Clay figurines found in her shrines show her holding infants, or sometimes pressing hands over wounded animals, the oldest known symbols of healing. From Enlil, the stern ruler of air and destiny, came law and kingship, structure, hierarchy, the idea that justice must be spoken aloud and recorded. One ancient inscription claims Enlil placed the measuring line upon the earth, teaching mortals how to weigh fairness and define borders. And from radiant Inanna, ever restless, came the gifts of music, weaving, and passion, the unmeasurable arts that make life worth enduring. Her temple singers composed hymns that would echo for millennia. One of the oldest known poems, Inanna and the Hulupu Tree, describes her tending a tree that shelters life, a metaphor for growth, creativity, and the perils of desire. Together, these gifts became the bones of civilization. Cities bloomed again. Uruk with its walls and scribes, Ur with its lunar priests, Lagash with its farmers and traders. Clay tablets multiplied like seeds in a floodplain, carrying the earliest myths, contracts, and lullabies. The Sumerians recorded not only what they owned, but what they wondered. Yet, as with all divine bargains, there was a shadow. For every gift the gods bestowed, there seemed a price hidden in the fine print of fate. The Sumerians noticed that while their cities grew prosperous, they also grew restless. Fields demanded endless labor, canals needed constant care, taxes, offerings, and wars drained the people. The same divine order that gave life also demanded sacrifice. In one myth, Enlil reflects upon his own creations and murmurs, "Their hands never rest, their breath is for toil." Some scholars see in this an ancient anxiety, that humanity, in accepting the gods' gifts, also accepted servitude. Civilization was not merely divine generosity, it was obligation dressed in splendor. The temples, magnificent as they were, became the center of this exchange. They managed the food, labor, and ritual life of the city. Priests calculated the rations of barley and oil owed to the gods, and threw them to the people. These records, found in thousands of tablets, show that the divine economy ran with bureaucratic precision. Every goat, every jar of honey, every bushel of grain was accounted for and taxed. A curious detail survives from Ur. Among lists of temple workers, there appear the names of child singers, young boys and girls whose duty was to sing hymns during dawn rituals. Some historians think this shows the early rise of organized education. Others see it as a form of servitude, hidden beneath piety. Historians still argue, as one modern scholar put it, whether these temples were centers of worship or factories of obedience. Still, the Sumerians didn't resent the gods. Not exactly. Their relationship was one of awe, not of rebellion. The world worked, crops grew, cities thrived. Therefore, the system must be right. When famine struck or storms destroyed harvests, people saw it as imbalance, not injustice. The gods were testing them or reclaiming what they were owed. There is, however, one haunting tale that hints at a growing unease. It tells of a time when humans, weary of ceaseless labor, cried out for mercy. Their voices rose to heaven, and Enlil grew angry at their noise, just as before the flood. But Enki, ever the ally of humankind, intervened again. He sent dreams to a wise priest, teaching him how to speak to the gods with respect, how to balance prayer and rest. Thus, festivals were born, not merely as celebration, but as sanctioned pauses in divine work. The Akitu festival, marking the new year, became the grandest of these pauses. For 12 days, kings relinquished their crowns, priests reenacted creation myths, and the people feasted. In the final ceremony, the high priest would slap the king lightly across the face. If the king's tears fell, it was seen as a good omen, proof of humility before the gods. One might call it the first corporate performance review. Through such rituals, the people reminded themselves, and perhaps their divine patrons, that giving and taking must remain in balance. Still, whispers persisted. In the dark corners of taverns and workshops, people murmured that the Anunnaki took more than they gave, that the gods drank their beer, ate their grain, and demanded loyalty in exchange for thunder and dust. A few clay tablets even contained scribbled complaints, little prayers that read more like muttered sarcasm. One laborer's text found near Lagash reads, "O Enlil, my back aches from your generosity." It's nice to know that even 5,000 years ago, people were still making workplace jokes. And yet, for all their grumbling, the people of Sumer remained devoted. They built the world's first schools, first libraries, first codes of law, each act traced back, in their minds, to divine instruction. The gods might have demanded much, but they had also given meaning. Tonight, as the fires dimmed and the scribes rolled up their clay tablets, families sat beneath the stars and told stories. Stories of the Anunnaki walking the earth, of Enki's laughter, of Inanna's dance. Civilization might have been born from duty, but it lived through imagination. In that balance between work and worship, gratitude and grumbling, humanity found its rhythm. The fields might be demanding, the temples hungry, but as long as the stories were told, the gifts still felt alive. Across the plains of Sumer, the skyline began to change. Where once only huts and clay brick homes stood, now immense towers rose, layered and gleaming in the desert light. These were the Ziggurats, temples built not just to house the gods, but to reach them. Each one seemed to scrape at the edge of heaven, its sides climbing in tiers of sun-dried brick, each level narrower than the last, until at the summit stood a small shrine veiled in incense and mystery. From a distance, these towers looked like mountains, man-made sacred peaks meant to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine. The Sumerians called them Enki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. And indeed they believed the ziggurat was not a symbol, but an axis, a literal connecting point between worlds. The gods, they said, descended upon its highest platform when they wished to speak to humankind, and priests climbed its steep stairways bearing offerings, messages, and hopes. At dawn, when the first light touched the uppermost terrace, the city would awaken to the sound of temple bells and the smell of burning myrrh. The priests in white linen would emerge from their quarters, ascending slowly, always in silence. Each step was a prayer, each landing a breath between worlds. From atop the ziggurat, the view was vast and humbling. The rivers shimmered in the distance, threading between fields of barley and date palms. Below, the city bustled like an anthill, merchants shouting, potters shaping clay, children chasing goats. But up there, amid the wind and dust, everything felt hushed. It was said that those who stood upon the summit could hear the gods whisper. Whether that whisper came from the breeze or from the mind's quiet wonder, no one could say. The ziggurats were feats of engineering. Each was built on a solid platform of baked bricks, bound with bitumen, its sides sloped to prevent erosion from the rare but fierce rains. At their core, ancient builders often placed small offerings, clay figurines, tablets, even animal bones, as if to feed the structure's spirit. Archaeologists today have found these buried treasures still intact, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The largest of all, the Ziggurat of Ur, still stands in southern Iraq, weathered but defiant against time. Built around 2100 BCE by King Ur-Nammu, it rose nearly 100 feet high. Though its upper temple has long vanished, the base remains, its massive stairway still leading skyward. In his inscriptions, Ur-Nammu declared that he built it for Inanna, the moon god, to dwell among men. One can almost imagine the scene. Under a pale moon, priests lighting torches on the terraces, their flames flickering like stars fallen to earth. But the ziggurat was more than a temple. It was also a calendar, a kind of earthly observatory. On clear nights, Sumerian astronomer priests climbed its steps to watch the heavens. They charted the movement of the moon, Venus, and the stars, believing each celestial shift was the language of the Anunnaki. From these nightly vigils emerged one of humanity's oldest sciences, astronomy. The priests noticed that Venus, Inanna's star, appeared both in the morning and evening, and from this duality they drew lessons about life and death, descent and return. They tracked eclipses, mapped constellations, and divided the sky into paths, the earliest version of the zodiac we still use today. To the Sumerians, studying the stars was not curiosity, it was reverence. The sky was a tablet written by the gods, and the priests were its readers. They believed that by interpreting omens, a red moon, a sudden comet, the flight of birds, they could glimpse the intentions of the divine. Some of their records read like early weather reports, others like poetry. When the star of the lion stands bright in the east, the king's enemies will fall like sheaves of grain. Historians still argue whether these observations were purely spiritual or whether the Sumerians had stumbled onto a form of empirical astronomy. After all, their calendars and predictions were astonishingly precise. But perhaps to them there was no difference. To measure the heavens was to understand the gods' rhythm. One curious tablet from Nippur describes a priest who claimed to have dreamed of the Anunnaki returning on a stairway of light. He woke, it says, and ordered torches placed along the ziggurat steps during rituals, so that from afar it would seem as though fire itself was climbing towards the sky. Some scholars see in this story the earliest spark of the later Tower of Babel legend, humanity's yearning to reach the divine, and the tension that always follows. Still, the ziggurats were not built out of arrogance, but devotion. The people didn't wish to surpass the gods, only to be nearer to them. They believed that by maintaining these towers, by feeding the temples and tending the rituals, they kept the universe in balance. If the ziggurat fell into disrepair, so too might the world. Yet there were whispers, subtle, uneasy, that the gods had grown distant. The Anunnaki no longer appeared in dreams as often as before. Their voices were faint, their omens harder to read. The priests wrote hymns pleading for signs, for reassurance that the divine still walked among them. One fragment from Ur laments, "We climb your house of heaven, yet find no footsteps. Have you gone to the far stars?" It's a small, aching question, and perhaps the oldest echo of doubt in human history. Still, the rituals continued. The ziggurat lights burned each night. The priests watched the stars, recorded their paths, and told the people that the gods were patient, not absent. The faithful believed them, for belief itself was part of the structure, another brick in the great tower that connected heaven and earth. A quirky but wonderful detail. During certain festivals, priests would place small loaves of bread and cups of beer at the Ziggurats summit for the gods. But by morning, when the priests climbed up again, they'd often find the offerings missing, likely taken by birds or night wanderers. Still, they'd proclaim, "The gods have eaten." In a way, they were right. The world itself had consumed the gift. And so the Ziggurats endured, half temple, half telescope, wholly human in their longing. They were monuments to faith, labor, and the dream that somewhere beyond the blue dome of the sky, someone was watching back. Each brick, each stair, was a prayer baked in the sun. And as the wind whispered through their crumbling edges, one could almost hear what the Sumerians must have felt, that the distance between earth and heaven was not so vast after all. In the heart of the desert, buried beneath layers of time and dust, the past whispers through clay. Thousands upon thousands of small tablets, etched with wedge-shaped marks, still carry the voices of Sumer, the first scribes, the first stories, the first attempts to record the will of the gods. When these tablets were first unearthed in the 19th century, many archaeologists could hardly believe what they saw. Here were records so old that even the Bible's patriarchs would seem like latecomers. Each tablet, when translated, revealed a fragment of a world both familiar and impossibly strange. A world where the Anunnaki still moved among men, and where time itself stretched beyond reason. Among the most puzzling of these finds was the Sumerian king list. Inscribed in careful cuneiform, it presented an unbroken line of rulers, each city taking turns as the seat of divine kingship. Yet the reigns of the earliest kings seemed impossible. Ululim, the first king of Eridu, was said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alulgar, for 36,000. Together, these reigns spanned tens of millennia before the Great Flood. Modern scholars often smile at these numbers, suggesting they might symbolize dynasties rather than lifetimes, or encode cycles of the moon and stars. But others, particularly fringe theorists, have wondered, were these kings something more than human? Were they, as the myths suggest, the gods themselves, the Anunnaki, who descended from heaven to rule the earth? It's a tantalizing idea, one that has inspired countless books, documentaries, and debates. The text itself seems to draw a clear line between two epochs. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven once more. The phrase "descended from heaven" appears again and again in Sumerian inscriptions, as if it described not an abstract blessing, but an actual visible descent. Some tablets go further, describing the Anunnaki arriving in shining chariots that flashed like silver, roaring as they landed. For modern readers, it's hard not to notice the resemblance to modern notions of spacecraft, though for the Sumerians, these were divine vehicles, the thunderous chariots of celestial kings. Still, historians argue whether such passages were meant literally. Were they metaphor, myth, or memory? The truth may lie somewhere between, a poetic attempt by ancient minds to describe the awe of witnessing something beyond comprehension. Imagine the night skies of Sumer, vast, black, and utterly silent. No streetlights, no noise of engines, just the desert wind and the stars, more numerous than sand grains. In that stillness, even a meteor streaking across the heavens would seem like a divine visitation. To a people whose lives were ruled by the rhythm of the sky, such sites would naturally find their way into story and stone. But the tablets are not merely tales. They are also ledgers, contracts, hymns, and records of temple offerings. The same hands that wrote of shining chariots also noted the price of barley and the weight of silver. This blend of the ordinary and the cosmic gives Sumerian writing its hypnotic balance, half divine revelation, half daily bureaucracy. One particularly intriguing find is known as the Gudea cylinders, two massive clay scrolls discovered in the ruins of the city of Lagash. They tell the story of King Gudea, who claimed to have received detailed instructions from the god Ninhursag, blueprints almost, for building a temple. In his dream, the god's messenger showed him a star map of the heavens and a plan drawn on a tablet of lapis lazuli. Gudea awoke, gathered his architects, and built exactly what he had seen. Was it just a vision, or was it, as some fringe writers suggest, a transmission, knowledge imparted from the Anunnaki themselves? Historians still debate how literal Gudea's dream might have been, but the result, the Temple of Ninhursag, became one of the most advanced architectural feats of its age. There's something charmingly human in how these ancient accounts blur the divine and the practical. One moment, a god descends on wings of fire, and the next, he's explaining floor plans. In other tablets, the gods are described using tools like measuring cords, lightning weapons, tablets of destiny that controlled the order of the world. Some of these descriptions, when read through modern eyes, seem eerily technological. The Tablet of Destinies, for example, is portrayed as an object that grants command over both heaven and earth, capable of decreeing fate itself. When the trickster god Anzu steals it, chaos erupts until it's recovered. To the Sumerians, this was myth, but for some modern interpreters, it hints at something else, a device of power, a control system, perhaps even an artifact of some advanced visitors. It's easy to see why such theories fascinate people. They transform myth into mystery, and mystery into possibility. Yet for all their wonders, these clay records also capture very human anxieties. One tablet from the city of Sippar describes a priest lamenting that the gods no longer answered his questions. They come not in dream nor omen. Their thrones are empty, their steps unlit. It's a fragile moment, the earliest written expression of spiritual doubt. Even so, the scribes kept writing. They recorded floods, kings, trade routes, and family disputes. They carved hymns to Inanna, Enlil, and Enki. They wrote of the bond between heaven and earth, and of the May, the divine decrees that governed all aspects of civilization: music, weaving, justice, even laughter. Each of these decrees, they said, had been gifted by the gods and written down for humanity to keep. And perhaps that is the most astonishing thing of all, that these stories, written on fragile slabs of mud thousands of years ago, still speak to us today. When we hold a tablet inscribed by a Sumerian scribe, we're holding the beginning of recorded thought, the very spark of written memory. A quirky historical tidbit: the Sumerians often recycled old tablets by scraping off the writing and using the clay again. As a result, some blank tablets discovered by archaeologists contained ghostly traces of older texts, visible only under infrared light, as if the stories refused to vanish, clinging to the clay like echoes of the first myths. In the end, the tablets of Sumer are more than relics. They are mirrors, reflecting our own hunger to understand where we come from and what forces, divine or otherwise, once shaped the path of humankind. For every inscription that begins with the words "the gods descended," another ends with a simple human act, the scribe's name, etched in humility, written by Ludingira, servant of Enki. So perhaps the real mystery isn't who the Anunnaki were, but how their stories, once pressed into wet clay by trembling hands, still hold us spellbound thousands of years later, whispering as softly as the desert wind that memory itself is sacred. When the first European explorers stumbled upon the mounds of Mesopotamia in the mid-1800s, they had little idea that beneath those hills of dust lay the oldest written civilization on Earth. Local shepherds called them tells, and travelers passed them by without a second glance. But when Austin Henry Layard, a young English adventurer, began digging into one near Mosul, the world of the Anunnaki stirred once again. Layard uncovered colossal stone figures, winged bulls with human faces, and endless walls covered in tiny wedge marks. He believed he had found Nineveh, the capital of ancient Assyria. But among the Assyrian ruins were far older layers, Sumerian tablets, fragments of stories that spoke of gods who descended from the heavens and ruled before the flood. Those early archaeologists, Layard, Henry Rawlinson, and Hormuzd Rassam, worked in brutal heat, their tents whipping in the desert wind. They packed thousands of tablets into crates, shipping them down the Tigris and across oceans to museums in London and Paris. In the process, they ignited a race, part scientific, part spiritual, to recover the forgotten world of Sumer. When Rawlinson finally deciphered cuneiform, the world's oldest known writing, he unlocked a door that had been sealed for 4,000 years. On those small clay tablets lay the blueprint of civilization itself: law codes, literature, contracts, hymns, and epic poetry. The modern world was stunned. The Bible's familiar stories, the flood, the creation of humankind, the confusion of tongues, all seemed to echo from these much older Sumerian records. One of the most shocking moments came when scholars translated the Epic of Gilgamesh and discovered its flood narrative, nearly identical in theme to that of Noah. In it, the god Enki warns a man named Utnapishtim of an impending deluge and instructs him to build a massive boat to save life on Earth. The parallels were too close to ignore. Historians still argue whether these tales spread westward and evolved into later scripture, or whether they sprang from some shared memory buried deep in humanity's past. But either way, the Sumerians had spoken first. By the early 20th century, archaeology had become a mixture of scholarship and obsession. Each dig promised revelations. Each artifact seemed to confirm or contradict a 1,000-year-old belief. Scholars like Leonard Woolley, excavating the city of Ur, found royal tombs glittering with gold and lapis lazuli, treasures so fine they made ancient kings seem almost divine. Woolley's team also uncovered a layer of river silt, nearly 8 feet thick, separating earlier ruins from later ones. To many, this was physical evidence of a massive flood, a geological echo of the very story told in Sumerian myth. Woolley himself believed it had been a local catastrophe, magnified by memory into a worldwide event. Others disagreed, pointing to the possibility that it marked the end of an entire era, perhaps even the same flood of the Anunnaki tales. For every measured scholar there was also a seeker, those drawn not by academia but by mystery. In the 20th century, writers like Zecharia Sitchin gave new life to the Anunnaki through bold interpretations of Sumerian texts. In his book, The 12th Planet, Sitchin argued that the gods were not mythic beings at all, but extraterrestrials visiting from a distant planet called Nibiru. According to his reading, these beings arrived on Earth over 400,000 years ago, seeking gold to repair their planet's atmosphere. They genetically engineered early humans, the so-called Adamu, as workers in their mines, blending divine essence with earthly play. To Sitchin's readers, it was a thrilling revelation that our creators were ancient astronauts, and that Sumerian myth was a coded record of first contact. Mainstream scholars dismiss these claims as pseudoscience, yet the allure was undeniable. The idea of the Anunnaki as cosmic engineers captured imaginations around the world. It fused archaeology, theology, and science fiction into something irresistibly strange and oddly hopeful. Even today, the debate continues. Some see the Anunnaki stories as allegories, poetic ways of explaining the dawn of civilization. Others argue they preserve fragments of an ancient truth, distorted by time. The line between myth and memory has always been thin, after all. One curious historical detail, often cited by both camps, involves Baghdad's 1930s battery jars, clay vessels with metal rods inside, believed by some to be primitive electric cells. Scholars think they were used for electroplating, but fringe theorists suggest they might have been remnants of lost technology, perhaps even knowledge passed down from the gods themselves. A more grounded but equally fascinating tidbit: the ancient Sumerians were among the first to document medical prescriptions, complete with instructions and ingredients. Some of their remedies still hold merit today: mixtures of willow bark, a natural source of aspirin, and honey for wounds. It's a reminder that not all ancient knowledge was mystical. Some of it was simply wise. Back in the academic world, the work continues quietly. Teams from around the globe still dig in Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash, carefully brushing sand from shattered tablets and mapping temple walls. Every few years, a new fragment surfaces, a hymn, a royal decree, or sometimes a single enigmatic line. The gods walked here once. One might expect the romance of the Anunnaki to have faded with modern science, but it hasn't. Instead, it has evolved. Astronomers searching for exoplanets and astrobiologists scanning for biosignatures are, in a strange way, continuing the same search, looking to the heavens for our origins. Historians still argue whether this yearning, this need to connect with something greater than ourselves, is instinct or inheritance. Maybe both. The Sumerians looked to the sky and saw gods. We look up and see galaxies. The questions haven't changed, only the language has. And perhaps that's why even today the story of the Anunnaki endures, because it asks something timeless. What if the first gods were our first teachers? What if the ancient scribes were not inventing, but remembering? In museums' basements and university archives, thousands of unread tablets still wait. Some are so brittle they crumble at a touch. Others bear only a few surviving signs. Yet hidden among them might be another fragment of a forgotten story, a single phrase that could rewrite what we think we know about where we came from. It's humbling, really, that humanity's search for its beginnings began with clay and still continues with the same wonder. From the deserts of Sumer to the stars beyond, the scholars and the seekers remain, side by side, chasing echoes of gods who may have never left at all. Empires rose, fell, and rose again across the same fertile plain where the Sumerians once gazed at the stars, yet through every new dynasty, every new language, the names of the Anunnaki continued to echo. They changed, as all ancient things do, their edges softened and reshaped by the tongues of later peoples. But the essence of those early gods, their dominion, their mystery, endured like faint starlight long after the dawn had passed. When Sumer faded, its cities swallowed by time, Babylon rose in its place, a city of gardens and towers, where priests still told stories that began with the words, "In the beginning." The Babylonians inherited the Sumerians' clay tablets, their myths, and their gods, though now those gods wore new names. Enki became Ea, the wise lord of the deep waters. Enlil remained the storm and the breath of command. And the bright star of Inanna was reborn as Ishtar, queen of love and war. Under King Hammurabi, Babylon became the center of the ancient world. His laws, etched into black diorite, proclaimed that justice itself descended from the heavens, from Shamash, the sun god, who traced his lineage back to the Anunnaki. Even in law, the divine legacy of Sumer pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. But it was in the grand epic of Enuma Elish, written centuries later, that the god story found new form. Here creation began not with clay and breath, but with cosmic battle, the young gods warring against Tiamat, the dragon of the sea. Out of her shattered body, they formed the heavens and the earth. At the head of these victors stood Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, a thunderous figure whose rise mirrored the city's own ambition. But even Marduk, for all his power, was built upon the bones of older tales. His triumph over Tiamat echoed Enlil's rule of order over chaos, and his role as lawgiver drew from Enki's cunning wisdom. The Babylonian priests, though they reworked the pantheon, never truly erased the Anunnaki. Instead, they adapted them, turning the ancient gods of Sumer into the ancestors of their own. One might say that mythology behaves like a river. It changes its course, but the water is the same. As centuries passed, those same currents flowed northward to Assyria. There, kings like Ashurbanipal built libraries to preserve the wisdom of the ages. His palace at Nineveh, gleaming with carved reliefs of winged beings, seemed almost to resurrect the old gods in stone. In one such carving, a bearded figure, half man, half divine, tends to a sacred tree, holding in his hand a strange object that looks uncannily mechanical. Scholars call these figures Apakalu, the divine sages who brought civilization to humanity. But to others, they are clear descendants of the Anunnaki, the heavenly visitors who once walked the earth. Ashurbanipal himself claimed to have read the writings of before the flood, preserved on tablets older than memory. His scribes copied them tirelessly, creating the collection we now call the Library of Nineveh, more than 30,000 tablets, including the Epic of Gilgamesh and ancient hymns to Inanna, Ishtar. When the city fell to fire and sword, those clay tablets baked hard in the flames, perfectly preserved by destruction itself. It's a curious thought that war, which destroys so much, sometimes becomes an unintentional archivist of the past. From Babylon and Assyria, the old stories spread westward, crossing into the lands of the Hebrews and beyond. There, echoes of the flood, the tower, and the divine council appear again, retold in the language of monotheism. "Let us make man in our image," says the book of Genesis. A phrase that scholars have long noted sounds like the deliberation of a pantheon, not a single god. Historians still argue whether this overlap is coincidence, cultural diffusion, or direct inheritance. But the parallels are undeniable. The flood of Noah and the flood of Utnapishtim, the Tower of Babel and the Ziggurats of Sumer, the Garden of Eden watered by 4 rivers, and the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, all point back, quietly but persistently to the same ancient source. Even the Hebrew word Eden may trace its roots to the Sumerian Eden, meaning plain or steppe. It's as though the earliest stories of gods and creation, carried by memory and migration, re-emerged in new tongues, but kept their ancient heart. By the time of the Persians, the Anunnaki had become distant figures, absorbed into broader cosmologies. Yet fragments of their myths survived in curious places, in Zoroastrian tales of divine councils, in Greek stories of titans cast down from heaven, even in the apocryphal writings that later fed Christian mysticism. Some later scribes described the Anunnaki not as gods, but as watchers, celestial beings who observed and guided humanity. It's an idea that would later reappear in the Book of Enoch, where divine watchers descend to earth, take human wives, and teach forbidden knowledge. Though written thousands of years later, the resemblance to Sumerian tales of divine descent is uncanny. Modern scholars note that such parallels likely reflect the long memory of Mesopotamian culture, ideas passed through Babylonian captivity and absorbed into Jewish thought. Yet for those who see myth as coded truth, it feels less like inheritance and more like revelation reoccurring through time. A curious historical detail: when the Babylonians celebrated their New Year's festival, priests reenacted the Enuma Elish each spring. The high priest would slap the king's face before the statue of Marduk, forcing him to weep as proof of his humility before the gods. Only then could he reign another year. The ritual was said to renew both the monarch's authority and the order of the cosmos, a reminder that in Mesopotamia, power always flowed downward from the divine. Even after empires crumbled and temples turned to dust, the imagery of the old gods endured. Winged beings carved on Assyrian walls found echoes in later angelic art. The sacred tree, tended by the Anunnaki and Apakalu alike, evolved into the Tree of Life, a symbol shared across faiths. And the notion of humanity as clay shaped by divine hands never left us. It simply became metaphor instead of memory. Historians still argue whether these parallels prove continuity or coincidence. Yet perhaps what matters more is what they reveal about us. That every age, every empire, has sought to understand its place beneath the stars. From the first Sumerian hymn to the last Babylonian prayer, the gods of the Anunnaki remained, if not in body, then in spirit. They became the architects of myth itself, the first great pattern from which all later stories were woven. And though their names faded from the tongues of men, the rhythm of their presence lingered, in temples, in scriptures, in dreams. Even now, when someone looks up at the night sky and wonders who might be watching from above, they're knowingly repeating the same act of awe that began in Sumer so long ago. The gods may have ascended, the Ziggurats may have crumbled, but the echoes of the Anunnaki still hum beneath history's surface, faint, eternal, waiting for someone to listen. The world has changed beyond anything the ancient scribes of Sumer could have imagined. Cities of glass and light now rise, where once stood temples of clay. Airplanes trace silver lines across the sky that their ancestors once believed to be paths of the gods. Yet, in a curious way, the Anunnaki have never truly left. They live on, not in statues or sanctuaries, but in stories. Their echoes rippled through science fiction novels, conspiracy forums, scholarly debates, and late-night documentaries that whisper about visitors from the stars. Their names, once spoken only in temple hymns, now appear in digital texts and streaming titles, flashing across screens for new generations who still seek meaning among the constellations. It's strange, isn't it, that something born in the dust of Mesopotamia could find its way into the circuitry of the modern age. But perhaps that's exactly what the Sumerians meant when they said the gods were eternal, not immortal in body, but indestructible in memory. In the quiet of modern night, their stories still breathe. When someone reads about the Anunnaki by lamplight, or gazes at the stars and feels that small electric wonder of being human, the old connection stirs again, the same impulse that led the first storytellers to press stylus into clay. Across the ages, that thread has never broken. From the Ziggurats of Ur to the observatories of today, humanity has always looked upward, hoping to glimpse its reflection in the heavens. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were purely mythic beings, symbolic of natural forces and royal power, or distorted memories of real events. Some say they represent our ancestors' awe before the mysteries of creation. Others, more daringly, suggest they might be encoded recollections of lost civilizations or even ancient visitors from beyond our world. But maybe the truest answer lies somewhere in between. Maybe the Anunnaki endure because they are both, divine and human, memory and metaphor. They represent our longing to belong to something vast, our refusal to believe we are alone. Each era reshapes them in its own image. To the Sumerians, they were the builders of cities and bearers of knowledge. To the Babylonians, they were gods of justice and fate. To modern seekers, they are symbols of cosmic ancestry, the bridge between science and myth. And for dreamers lying awake beneath starlit skies, they are simply the oldest story, the one that asks, where did we come from, and who might still be watching? A quirky note from our own time. The Sumerian word Anunnaki still appears in scientific naming. A minor asteroid discovered in 2001 was christened Anunnaki, a tiny celestial wanderer orbiting the same stars that once inspired the myths. It's as though the universe itself acknowledged its storytellers, letting their name drift among the heavens once more. In museums, the tablets of clay sit behind glass, small, brown, and unassuming. Visitors pass by, unaware that those wedge-shaped markings are the reason they can read, write, and record their own histories today. Every keyboard, every text, every book owes a quiet debt to those first scribes who wrote the words, "The gods descended." And perhaps in a symbolic way, they were right. For when humanity first learned to write, the divine truly did descend into language, into art, into consciousness. The power once attributed to gods became the inheritance of humankind. Today, our myths wear new faces. Astronauts, algorithms, artificial intelligence. We have our own Anunnaki now, creations that extend human will into the heavens and beyond. But the heartbeat of the old stories remains unchanged. The Sumerians believed that to speak of the gods was to keep them alive. And so every time their names are spoken, Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, something ancient stirs again, like embers glowing beneath the ash of time. We might never know whether the Anunnaki truly walked this earth, or if they existed only in the imagination of the world's first storytellers. But does it matter? Their legacy is not proof, but presence, the enduring hum of wonder that moves through every generation that dares to ask, why? When night falls and the stars begin to shimmer above cities and deserts alike, it's easy to imagine that somewhere, far beyond our sight, the old gods are still watching. Not as masters, perhaps, but as witnesses, silent, patient, curious. And maybe they smile, seeing how far their children have come. Because in the end, every civilization, ancient or modern, begins with a story. And stories, like gods, never truly die. They sleep, waiting to be spoken again. So tonight, as the hum of the modern world fades and the night deepens, remember those first whispers from the cradle of civilization, the voices of the Anunnaki, carried across 5,000 years of wind and silence.